We were walking down a dark, deserted street in Los Angeles. It was Halloween night, and although the air was cool, I felt the heat of excitement coursing through me. With me were Thomas, Jenny, and Michael, our small but tight-knit group. Each of us was dressed up, Thomas as a vampire, Jenny as a witch, Michael in a clown mask, and I in an old cloak with black lenses over my eyes, a weak attempt to look mysterious. We were heading to a party, one that had been passed around by word of mouth. It was taking place in an old house, rumored to be abandoned, but we couldn't resist the challenge. The house loomed before us like a shadow from the past, creaking and groaning in the wind. Its windows were dark, and a few old street lights flickered weakly around it, barely illuminating the facade. Perfect place for Halloween, I thought. The music inside set a false sense of security, a deceptive lull. Everyone was in costume, which gave us a bit of comfort, as though we were all in this together. We entered, blending in with the crowd. The air inside buzzed with party energy, but something about the house felt off. There was an uneasy tension that clung to the walls, like they remembered something horrible. After a while, we noticed something strange. People who went down into the basement never came back. At first, we didn't think much of it, but after several more familiar faces disappeared, Thomas voiced what we were all thinking: something's wrong here. Michael nodded and suggested we go check it out. I didn't want to, but curiosity mixed with fear got the best of me. The basement was poorly lit. We descended the narrow stairs, and with each step, the darkness seemed to thicken, as did the growing sense of dread. Jenny was leading, her phone's light guiding the way. Behind the door at the bottom, it was eerily quiet, too quiet for a house still echoing with party music above. What we saw behind that door made my blood run cold. It was a corridor lined with several doors, dimly lit by flickering bulbs. From somewhere, a soft, barely audible whisper floated in the air, making us freeze. We moved forward, feeling every step way heavier than the last. One door was slightly ajar, and through it we saw what looked like a twisted medical room. On the beds were people. Their arms and legs were bound to metal rails. Some were quietly groaning. Others lay still with vacant, hollow eyes. Nearby tables were strewn with syringes, filthy instruments, and vials of strange medications. On one wall hung old medical charts, but I didn't dare get close enough to read them. These weren't just random victims. Their bodies were covered in bruises, cuts, and in some places I could see strange injection marks. "What the hell is this?" Jenny whispered. Thomas was trying to untie one of the women, but her eyes were empty, as if she had long ceased to be aware of where she was. I felt my chest tighten with fear. There was something rotten in the air, something that screamed for us to run. "We need to call the police," Michael said. "We can't leave them here." But at that moment, the door we had come through suddenly slammed open. Several figures in masks stood there, staring at us. Their faces were hidden, but their eyes burned with cold malice. They moved quickly, like hunters, and we knew it was time to go. But it was too late. One of them grabbed Jenny by the arm. Another lunged at Thomas. I saw Michael trying to fight back, but they hit him, and he fell to the floor. Panic took over me. The masked figures were getting closer. In a moment of pure instinct, I broke free of the hands that tried to grab me. I fell but scrambled to my feet, my eyes locking onto the only exit. "Run," I shouted. We bolted out of the basement, leaving behind our friends. Thomas and Michael somehow managed to escape too, though I don't remember how. I saw their terrified faces, their gasping forms racing toward the door. Jenny was lost in the chaos. When we finally burst out into the cool night air, the world outside felt unnaturally quiet. We ran to the nearest house and immediately called the police. The voice on the other end sounded concerned but skeptical. I could hear it in the tone they didn't believe us. It made sense. Our story of a basement, medical experiments, and masked figures sounded too unreal. The police arrived quickly. We stood outside the house, shaking with fear and cold. The officers went into the basement, and we were told to wait. We waited for what felt like hours. When they returned, their faces showed confusion. "There's nothing there," one of them said. I couldn't believe it. The basement was empty, they told us. The beds were gone, the medical equipment, everything. No masks, no drugs, no groaning victims. No one believed us. The police just shrugged it off. But we knew the truth. What we saw could never be forgotten. And though the nightmare seemed to have disappeared into the shadows, I had a sinking feeling it wasn't over. A few days later, Thomas went missing. It was a cold, windy Halloween night. Leaves like shadows swirled down the empty streets, and the eerie howling of the wind echoed from all directions. I was walking home from the celebration when, passing by Mr. Jones' house, I noticed a faint light flickering in one of the windows. Mr. Jones had been dead for a long time. They say he died 10 years ago, leaving his house empty and abandoned. Since then, the house hadn't just been vacant, it seemed to sink into oblivion. Its crooked walls, overgrown yard, and broken windows made it a place people avoided talking about. But the local kids couldn't resist telling each other scary stories. The legend said that Mr. Jones' spirit still haunted the house. The adults laughed at this, of course, but sometimes at night you could hear the creaking of doors and floorboards, as if someone was wandering inside. But the light, a dim, flickering candle burned in the window, and suddenly I was overcome with curiosity. What was going on in there? How could there be a light in a house that had been empty for over 10 years? My feet carried me closer to the house, even though my mind was screaming for me to stop. The house looked terrifying. Broken windows, peeling paint, a collapsed roof. Everything was so quiet that I could hear my own breath. As I approached, I peered through the window where the light was coming from. The glass was shattered, and through it, I could just catch a glimpse of the inside. What I saw made me freeze in place. In the center of the room stood a figure tall, unnaturally thin, almost skeletal. It was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, and the fabric seemed to be falling apart right before my eyes, as though time itself had worn it down. But the most terrifying thing wasn't that. The creature held a candle, the very one whose light I had seen from outside. Its face, or what should have been a face, looked distorted, as if covered in a strange, smoky haze. Its eyes, two black, hollow voids, were staring straight at me. I wanted to pull back, but I couldn't. Fear paralyzed every cell in my body. The figure, as if sensing my gaze, slowly turned its head toward me. The flame of the candle flickered, and at that moment, the figure took a step forward, closer to the window. I could hear its feet, old and bony, scraping across the wooden floor. And then, inside the house, a sound echoed, a heavy creak of a door, as if someone else was entering. I flinched and took a step back, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from what was happening. Suddenly, the air became cold, a bone-chilling sensation, as if something invisible had just passed through me, not through the door. The world seemed to freeze. The candlelight began to fade, plunging the house into darkness. And in that moment, I realized it wasn't just a legend. This was real evil, awakened on this grim Halloween night. I bolted, running as fast as I could, never looking back, feeling the icy breath of emptiness behind me. But even when I was far away, I could still hear the creaking floorboards in Mr. Jones' empty house, where his dark silhouette remained, waiting for its next victim.